Okay, I think people are filtering in. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. My name is Catherine Hecht. I'm the Executive Director of the Alexander Valley Film Society, and I am thrilled to welcome back Joseph McBride to lecture with us, share his experience with us about how Westerns made me. And before we get started, we'll do a little housekeeping on this end. We'll start with our land acknowledgement. The Alexander Valley Film Society recognizes that we are on unceded lands of the Coast Miwok, Pomo, and Wapo. We respectfully acknowledge the Indigenous people who have lived here for thousands of years and who continue to contribute in meaningful ways to their communities and our society as a whole. And next, we have to thank our donors and sponsors who have made this whole series free to the general public. And if you'd like to make a $10 suggested donation, I've put the link in the chat for everybody. You can go right to our website and make a donation there. And without further ado, I want to introduce our guest speaker for tonight. Joseph McBride is a professor in the School of Cinema at San Francisco State University. He grew up watching a Western every day on TV in the 1950s and another in the neighborhood theater on the weekend. They not only helped form his sensibilities and understanding of the complexities of American history, but established this genre, which can be surprisingly supple and nuanced to those who don't know it well, as his enduring favorite form of filmmaking. McBride's many books also include biographies of Frank Capra and Steven Spielberg, 3 books on Orson Welles, and the newly published critical study, Billy Wilder, Dancing on the Edge. As a bonus, Columbia University Press says that if you purchase the book through their website by using code CUP20, you will receive 20% off as a bonus for attending this lecture. And so I will put that code in the chat for everybody. And without further ado, and just so you know, hold your questions to the end. Joe's going to lecture for about 60 minutes. And then address any and all questions. We'll invite you to turn on your video, unmute yourselves in an orderly fashion, of course. And Joe, from here, take it away. So glad to have you back.
Thank you, Catherine. It's wonderful to be called back. And I really appreciate talking to your good group. With the questions last time were wonderful. And thank you to my former student, Tess, who's part of your group, and she's instrumental in having me here. I'm not coming to you from Monument Valley. I wish I were, but I'm coming to you from Berkeley, which is the next best thing. And I think the tribute to indigenous people is particularly relevant in this context, isn't it? Because the Western, as Leslie Fiedler writes in The Return of the Vanishing American, is mostly about the confrontation, he says, between the white man and the Native American. And sometimes it's peaceful, and more often it's not, unfortunately. It reflects the history of our country. It's one of our great contributions to world culture, like jazz is something that American people created. I once talked to a French person. I said, why do French people love Westerns so much? And he said, the wide open spaces, because they don't have them in France. You know, you look at Monument Valley, it's not as big as it appears, but it looks gigantic on screen. I went there in 1973. I've written 2 books on John Ford, who's the greatest Western director. I did a critical study called John Ford with Michael Wilmington, published in 1974. And I did a biography, Searching for John Ford, in 2001. Took 30 years. He's such a complex man to figure him out. But on the way to California, I went through Monument Valley, and that's the cover of the original British publication with the shot from The Searchers, classic ending shot. Martin Scorsese told me he loved that cover, and he regretted that they replaced it for the American edition with the black and white picture because they were cheap. But I want to show you something that I picked up in Monument Valley. When I was there, I hired an Indian guide, as you do, with a Jeep, George Holliday, who was, he had been an extra in a lot of Ford films. He knew all the locations. I said, could you show me where they shot the burning of the house in The Searchers, which is one of my favorite films? And he said, oh yeah. He said they made a terrible mess down there, which I was distressed to hear. I thought they would have cleaned up the mess, but I went there and I found remnants of the house that was burned in the searchers, and I have some. Here is a piece of the house. Uh, you see the charred. It's kind of hard here. This thing does weird stuff to the background, but you see part of the house and the searchers. And then I picked up a piece of the fake brick with the burn marks on it. And I tried to police the area, clean it up. I even found a piece of a little can of fire starter that they used to burn the house, and it was empty, but I should have taken that, but I didn't. But I tried to, clean it up. I'm surprised they didn't return it to nature as they should have. But anyway, the reason I thought of this topic was this, as she said, Catherine said, is my favorite genre, and it still is. And and it's a genre that is often described as moribund. Scott Simmons did a very good book on the history of the Western, the early days of the Western, when it was really big. And movies began this right around the time the frontier ended. Frederick Jackson Turner, a famous historian, gave a lecture in 1893 that the frontier in America had closed. Basically, the massacre at Wounded Knee was the end of the frontier in 1890, and John Ford was born in 1894, and films began in 1894. It's all tied in. And they made a lot of Westerns in the early days. And Scott Simmons points out most of the early Westerns are very sympathetic to Native Americans. And they romanticize them. And it's kind of a part of human nature that once you've killed off people, you tend to romanticize them, the vanishing American, as we called it. So there's a kind of double edge to it. And I had a TA in my Ford class who was a Native American. She did a really interesting presentation on why it was in the 1930s, Indians started to be demonized in Westerns. And she said it had to do with the changing American policy toward reservations. That we started, there was this whole drive toward assimilating Indian kids. Even the name Indian, of course, is a false name, but that's what it's called in Westerns usually. And a lot of Native Americans still like the name Indian, so I'll use that interchangeably. But they would take kids from the reservations and put them in so-called Indian schools and try to train them into being kind of ersatz white people, which helped destroy their culture. But they're stubbornly still around, and Monument Valley is part of the Navajo reservation, and people live there. They call themselves the People. That's their name for themselves, and they're wonderful. I interviewed a bunch of Navajos about what they thought of John Ford. It was a really interesting experience. When I was there, I mean, they all liked John Ford, and he was very good to them, and they really liked that he gave them jobs. As John Ford said, many of my colleagues speak about their love of the Indians, but more humbly, I gave them work. I like that line. And he also said, being Irish, he said, who better than the Irish to understand the Indians and the US cavalry? We're on both sides of the epic. That's a picture I took of John Ford in 1970 when I interviewed him for an hour on the last day of his career. It's a long story I tell in my biography. I arrived on the day his career was ending, and he announced his retirement in the course of the interview. Hopefully not because I was there, but he actually, it was very sad. I found out later a project he was trying to do, an Italian Western his friend Woody Strode had set up for him, was failing, and he realized it. He couldn't get a job in Hollywood the last 5 years of his career, which is a terrible blot on Hollywood's record. But it was a difficult interview. Ford was like the most difficult person to interview, and the interview is online. At the risk of embarrassment, I put the unedited tape online. You can hear it. But he said some things that were very profound, and then he would pretend he didn't remember certain films, and he put me on, and he was argumentative. But it was a great experience for somebody who was going to write a biography of him, even though I didn't know that at the time, just to be in his presence, to pick up his body language. And I found that he was very defensive and very kind of sensitive. And here's a 23-year-old kid, and I mean, he'd been in the film business since 1914, and he seemed to be a little threatened by being asked about his films. Part of it was that's the last thing he wanted to talk about as his career was ending. But anyway, why did I love Westerns so much? I realized later, and this was like, it's funny how you don't think about these things. It's my family background. The West is very close to us. It seems almost mythical, and it is mythical in some ways. We turn it into a myth of it's the way we speak about our history, and our history is mostly a pack of lies, as Ford showed us in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, and as we see when we study history. But we're very close to it in terms of genealogy, and my family on both sides were Western immigrants. They came from Ireland on both sides, and um, on my McBride side, there was a Gallagher family. They were coal miners in Pennsylvania, and they came to Nebraska by wagon train. Nebraska was considered the West in those days. General John O'Neill, a Civil War figure, led a wagon train west and stopped in what became O'Neill, Nebraska, where my grandfather John McBride was born, and he and his father and brother had come from Iowa by wagon train. And then um, Edward married Hannah Gallagher, and my grandfather was born the year after the gunfight at the OK Corral, and it shows you how recent time that was. And our greatest claim to fame as a family, I married into an Irish family who love Westerns. And the only thing about our family history that impresses them is that we were robbed by the Jesse James gang. They thought that was so amazing because, as my late father-in-law, Noel O'Hara, said, I thought they were just mythological characters, but they actually robbed us. They took our horses at one point because they were on the run from a bank robbery or something. And they said, we need new horses, fresh horses, and they swapped horses. They were nice. They just said, we're going to swap horses. They didn't take no for an answer, but I thought if we had stuffed their horses today, we might be rich. We could have a museum or something, but we didn't do that. But anyway, that's how close it is. And my grandfather, John McBride, became a school teacher for a long time. And he worked for a year on an Indian reservation before he became a teacher. He was selling cloth goods. And he wrote in an autobiography in 1950, he says, it was a great experience being with the Indians and seeing their way of living and doing business. I'm convinced after that experience that the red man was more sinned against than sinned. And so with John Ford, for example, he started out treating Indians as if they were just a threat and, noble savages or whatever. And he was interested in them. And when he was a kid, I found in his papers, he would always draw doodles of Indians and cowboys, especially Indians with great headdresses in his school papers. But on Stagecoach, for example, they just attack the wagon train, but they become more and more sympathetic as they go along. And I'll talk about that as I progress here. And I asked his research assistant, Catherine Clifton, why that was. And she said very simply, he came to know them. Very profound. He became friendly with them. And as I said, they respected him and were grateful. For example, in 1948, they had a terrible snowstorm and they were in danger of starving. And he organized an airplane airlift to drop food and hay for their horses and things in there, and they never forgot that. But when I was in Monument Valley in 1973, one of the Indians I met was a young guy who just got back from Vietnam. Excuse me. And I said, did you know Ford and John Wayne? And he said, yeah, I was around. And I said, what do you think of Ford? And he said, is he the old guy with the eye patch? He's okay. And I said, what do you think of John Wayne? And his mood changed very rapidly because the Indians said they thought Wayne was their friend. He was a nice fellow. They got along with him well. He was, a good guy. But then he gave an interview to Playboy that was infamous, where he said the Indians deserved what they got because they wouldn't share their land, which was outrageous. And this young guy said, if he ever comes back here to make a Western, I'm going to be up in those rocks with my M1 rifle from Vietnam and I'll pick him off, he said. And I thought, geez, what a story that would be. Indian kills John Wayne. And I had a crisis of conscience because I began thinking, what will I do if John Wayne announces he's going to make another Western? Will I call him up and warn him, or just let history happen? And fortunately, I didn't have to make that decision. He never went back. he did some day trail commercials against a backdrop, just like I'm doing, but he never went back to Monument Valley. But Wayne is a divisive figure, of course, but people who just think he's a horrible racist. He was different as a person in some ways from what he was on screen. And today, in today's world, we don't seem to understand the difference between the artist and the art. If an artist did something bad 30 years ago, you can't watch his films or look at his paintings or read his books or something, and it's very short-sighted. It's a kind of an anti-art sensibility, because artists are human beings, flawed like all of us, and some are very flawed, and most artists are very flawed people. That's why they become artists, and appreciate complexity. And Wayne certainly conveys a lot of complexity, but his best films, directed by Ford and Hawks and a few other directors, are not what you would think. For example, Fort Apache, one of my favorite films, he's the one who's sympathetic to Indians. He's the cavalryman who understands and is sympathetic to the Apaches. And Henry Fonda, who in real life was the liberal, good guy, and politically is played a martinet who was a racist and hated Indians. And here they are in Fort Apache with Miguel Inclán, a Mexican actor, playing Cochise. And it's a great, great film. It's one of the three films I want to talk about today, but let me go into that. Today, when I was a kid, we all watched Westerns all the time. As Catherine said, every day after school, there was a show called Foreman Tom's Jamboree on TV in Milwaukee. 4 o'clock, some guy would show a Western. And then on weekends, we'd go to the Tosa Theater in Wauwatosa, Wisconsin, which is now called the Rosebud Theater, which is maybe more appropriate. And we'd see a Western or a sci-fi film. And I saw tons of Westerns. And I didn't like TV Westerns much because I liked the wide open spaces. I liked the color and or black and white or beautiful landscapes. I didn't like the back lot Westerns very much. But I began thinking, I was a little guy back then, and I was getting beaten up and abused both at school and at home every day. And I was for the underdog all the time politically, and it was the period of the civil rights movement. I was very in favor of civil rights for African Americans, etc. And I kept wondering, how come these Indians keep getting beaten in all these Westerns that I'm watching? What's going on here? And I kept thinking, I'd like to see one where they win, And one day on Foreman Tom's Jamboree, I saw one where the Indians won. I was so thrilled. And I don't know what it was. It might have been Fort Apache, because it's one of the few films from that period where the Indians win. And in that film, they not only win, it's a kind of a version of the Custer story. They annihilate the white cavalry unit who were foolishly attacking them. And wrongly attacking them, but they're the good guys. They're the heroes of the film. This is Henry Fonda there playing a version of Custer and John Wayne. This is the climactic moment of the film where Fonda decides to split his troops like Custer did, a fatal classic military mistake, and Wayne warns him against it. And he says, we're going to charge. And Wayne says, I wouldn't do that, because he knows the Indians are just over the ridge. And Fonda says, we're going to do it anyway. And Wayne defies him. And Fonda says, I'll answer you with pistols or a court-martial. I found out this was filmed the morning I was born, this scene, August 9th, 1947 at 11 a.m. This scene was filmed. So I feel kind of a kinship with this picture. I was curious because I knew they were shooting it when I was born. And this is a scene where Wayne should have shot his commanding officer or arrested him because they all know that he's a madman, as Ward Bond points out, one of the troopers, and they follow him into disaster. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But anyway, so I saw Fort Apache, and but the film that really kind of first made a huge impact on me was Rio Bravo, the Howard Hawks film. In 1959, I was 12. And, I went to see it because I was a Ricky Nelson fan. Ricky Nelson was in the film playing a young gunman and singing a song, and I was a fan of his. And I was, as a John Wayne fan, I didn't know who Howard Hawks was. I told this to Hawks later, and Hawks said, "Well, I didn't know you had such good taste in music." He thought that was very funny, and I said, "Why did you cast Ricky Nelson?" He said, "Because in Japan they had a big billboard, and Ricky Nelson's picture was 3 times the size of John Wayne's picture, and it grossed $3 million more because Ricky Nelson was in it." He was very pragmatic. Nelson is good. He's charming in the film, but I just went to see it thinking this was going to be another fun Western. And what really kind of stunned me was it's the first film I saw that resonated with my own life that I was living every day. Dean Martin plays a drunken deputy who here he's having a crisis, wondering if he's going back to the bottle. And my parents were alcoholics. And so every day we had to deal with the hellish home environment, my parents screaming at each other and drinking. And it was a horrible time. And so I see this guy, he's completely authentic as an alcoholic. And then he hears this Mexican music, the de Guelo, which was the music that the Mexicans played at the Alamo to kind of threaten the guys in the Alamo. And it emboldens him to pour back the drink if Tess could put that shot up. There's this frame enlargement for the film. This shot made a huge impression on me when I was 12 in the theater. He pours back the drink into the bottle. It's a great moment in the film. He is just perfect. I mean, it's a serious role. He's funny, but he's serious. The film is a very funny film, but it has this deep core of seriousness. What it's about is a friend, John Wayne, who's a strong character. He's kind of fatherly figure, but he has some flaws too. But he's rehabilitating his friend. That's what the film really is about. So you see them here, and this is an early part of the film where Martin, as you see, is kind of a mess, and Wayne is, stalwart sheriff. But they all have their flaws. It's about camaraderie and friendship, and it made a gigantic impression on me. And Robin Wood said this film, to him, justifies the existence of Hollywood because it has what you could call Western cliche characters. And yet Hawks and his screenwriters make them very real. Great screenwriters in this film, Lee Brackett, who wrote a number of Hawks films, and Jules Furthman, who Pauline Kael, who I hate to quote, but she said that Jules Furthman and Ben Hecht wrote half of the good movies ever made in Hollywood. And the story credit goes to B.H. McCampbell. And I asked Hawks who that was. He said, "Oh, it's my daughter, Barbie." And I said, "Oh, what did she do?" And he said, "Well, she contributed to dynamite. They throw dynamite at the bandits, and she had some other ideas, so we give her a story credit," which I thought was kind of nice. But it was made in opposition to High Noon. He didn't like High Noon for its rhetorical preaching about this sheriff who's Hawks thought was not doing his job properly and was begging for help from everybody in town. Here am I talking to Howard Hawks at one of the numerous public events we did. And he expounded on his Westerns and why he made Rio Bravo as his riposte to High Noon. And I don't like High Noon either. I think it's kind of a phony rhetorical film. I know it has a lot of fans and admirers, but I think Rio Bravo is much more realistic, and also he valued professionalism highly, and he didn't like a sheriff, he said, running around like a chicken with his head cut off asking for help and nobody will help him. And John Wayne, in contrast, rejects help from people because he says you're amateurs and this is a job for a professional. That's why I'm hired here, So I was so impressed by this film and the mixture of comedy and humor that Hawks excels in. Just made a great impression. I mean, he's one of the directors who really respects writers, which is rare enough. And I asked him, I said, "Why don't you take writing credit in your films? Because I know you work on the scripts." Here I am. See how casual he was when I was at his home in Palm Springs. I would go down there and talk to him and always take a tape recorder. I didn't know I was doing an interview book. I just tape recorded the talks with him. Sometimes they published them and sometimes they didn't. And after he died, actually right before he died, I thought, well, I have almost enough for a book. I'll ask him questions I hadn't asked before. And the Directors Guild asked me to do a weekend with Hawks in his films. So I used that to fill in gaps and stuff. And then he died 2 months later. And he was a wonderful raconteur. He told tall tales. I wasn't maybe sufficiently vigilant about his tall tales. I learned later to be less trusting of what directors told me. That's another story. A Frank Capra book, which I see Virginia Clark here, my great copy editor who worked on that book, and a couple books with me. I really dissected all the lies that Frank Capra told about his career. But with Hawks, I was more kind of, a little gullible. So I did this book called Hawks on Hawks, which came out after his death. I put it together from all the tapes that I had. And it's a very entertaining book, I think, because he's a great storyteller and he's full of wisdom. Truffaut told me, he said he thought Hawks was the most intellectual American filmmaker, and he would deny it, Truffaut said, but he has a lot of theories and he always knows why he's doing things and he can explain it really well. And that's really true. He doesn't do things by instinct. He has it all thought out. And so it's in this book, and it's the closest thing to a Hawks autobiography. But I wanted to be a screenwriter, and I was working, teaching myself how to write screenplays. I eventually started selling them. And Hawks, I thought, knew more about storytelling than anybody else. So I was that was one of my motives for talking to him. I wanted to find out, how do you tell stories on film? And or what he was saying about why he didn't take credit. He said, if I did take credit, I couldn't get such good writers to work with me. And I thought that was so smart, because that was part of Capra's downfall. Capra was not a very good writer, but he started wanting to take credit on his films. He wasn't satisfied with just being a good director. He wanted to be the writer too. And that's part of the fallacy of what people think the auteur theory is, that in France, they developed it to explain directors who don't write their scripts and how they can still put their imprint on them. But in America, it's been sort of bastardized into you have to be the writer and the director. And Capra told me, he said, one of his lines was, being a director is almost as good as writing a book, he told me. So he respected writers more than he did directors. And that's kind of sad in a way, because he was a damn good director. But he started trying to take credit, and his good writers like Robert Riskin and Joe Swerling wouldn't work with him anymore. And so he began trying to write his own scripts, and they were really bad and he couldn't sell them. But Hawks didn't have that kind of ego. He had a huge ego in other ways, but he was willing to share credit because it's a collaborative medium. And one of the book projects I did, I edited 2 volumes of American Film Institute seminars, and I read 5 million words in 6 months and edited them into 2 books. And I used as an epigraph Alan Pakula, a very good director, very smart man. He said, the worst thing about film is that it's a collaborative medium, and the best thing about film is that it's a collaborative medium. I thought that says it all. So anyway, Rio Bravo showed me that films could reflect life as I was feeling it. And it meant so much to me. And the kind of conventionality of Rio Bravo, and yet how Hawks turns it into something very personal, was very instructive too. And I later got to know Jean Renoir, the great French director, and he said to me, the marvelous thing about Westerns is that they're all the same film that gives the director unlimited freedom. That's a wonderful comment about genre. You can take archetypes like Stagecoach did with Ford and Dudley Nichols, and characters who have appeared in hundreds of films, and make them real if you're a good writer and good director and have good actors. And that's part of what Westerns and genres do. And if you're a Western fan, you go to see them because there's certain elements that you want to see, but you want to see inflections on them, and you want to see differences, and you're willing to tolerate differences as long as you get kind of what you're looking for in some regard. And now we'll come to Fort Apache, which that changed my life. There are 2 or 3 films that changed my life. One was Dr. Strangelove. When I was 16, I went to see it soon after Kennedy was assassinated, which was really the turning point in my life, when it changed my life forever. And I started writing about it years later, and it kind of destroyed my belief in authority. Michael COEN wrote a book about Westerns, and he said, the history of Westerns is a history of the loss of faith in America, which is a sobering thought. And I think the Vietnam War helped kill the Western. I'll talk about that. But the Kennedy assassination disabused us of a lot of our notions about our government. And a coup occurred, and we were lied to about it. And I was in a transitional period anyway, about doubting my upbringing in the Catholic Church, and I went to see Dr. Strangelove, and the first time I saw it, I went with my best friend, who was the smartest guy I knew, and he was chuckling all the way through, and I thought it was like a serious Cold War thriller, because we had been raised to hide under our desks for fear of the atom bomb. And so I was kind of scared by it, and he was chuckling, and he said, let's sit through it again. And then I got it the second time. It's a black comedy. We weren't prepared for black comedies then. And by the end of that film, I had no respect left for authority at all. And so I was a different person when I walked out of the Tosa Theater. But um, when I saw Fort Apache, I was home from school at University of Wisconsin, came back to Milwaukee for Christmas. It was December 23rd, 1967. It meant so much to me, I wrote it down. I was watching it on TV, and I'd seen a few Ford films and I thought they were good, but this one changed my life, because I thought, wow, this is the kind of Western I wanted to see as a kid, that tells the truth about American history, that we're a nation formed with genocide and then later slavery, or around the same time, actually. But this film deals with genocide of Native Americans, and the brutal warfare that went on. And the Indians, as I mentioned, are the heroic figures. They're noble, and they're John Wayne is trying to bring peace with the Indians, and he works out a peace treaty with Cochise, who's an honorable man who he respects, and Henry Fonda violates that. And he says there's no sense of honor between an American officer and Cochise. And Wayne says, there is to me, sir. And you really respect Wayne at that point. And that's totally contrary to this myth of John Wayne that people have. And yet the tragedy of the film is that Wayne, by the end of the film, after the troop has been massacred, Wayne in effect becomes Colonel Thursday. His commanding officer is now dead, and he takes his position and he puts on that pretentious forage cap that Fonda has, and Ford plays the same music, and the men march out in the same camera positions and things. And it's a film that shows that the system is totally wrong and corrupt. And what confuses people about this film, I think one reason it's not better known, there are films that people cite as sympathetic to Native Americans that became kind of a trend in the 50s to some extent, with Broken Arrow and other films, but they never mentioned Fort Apache. And Tag Gallagher, who wrote a book on Ford, he wrote that this film is often cited as what's wrong with Ford, but it's people totally misunderstand this film. And the reason is that he does not portray most of the men as villains, except Thursday is clearly wrong and racist and a terrible person in many ways, although he's recognizably human. But John Wayne is a likable figure. Ward Bond is a likable figure. All the troopers are likable. Most of them are Irish immigrants. Ford likes them. And so Ford complicates our feelings about history, because history is not all carried out by evil, mustache twirling villains. That's a crude view of history. It's carried out by ordinary people. I'm reading another book about the Holocaust, which I read about all the time, and that's part of the sobering thought, is that the Holocaust was, sure, there were some hardcore Nazis directing it, but the mass of German people just kind of went along with it, and they had their prejudices and they had their weaknesses, but a lot of them just didn't have the courage to resist it. They knew it was wrong, but they thought, okay, well, we'll go along with it. And we see that in America today too. The Republican Party, people know that there's a madman controlling the party, and yet they go along with it, most of them, because it's expedient. And that's kind of what happens in Fort Apache. Is Ford is indicting the system, not particularly the men. However, what people don't think about is Ford had just spent 4 years in World War II, and among his duties for the OSS was filming the Nuremberg trials and making films about the Holocaust as evidence for the Nuremberg trials. So he was fully aware of the Nuremberg trials, and the Nazi defense was, the defendants said we were just following orders, and Americans and the Allies hanged 10 Nazis for saying that. I mean, that was their feeble excuse. So that was not a valid excuse. And so the fact that these men are just following orders blindly, Ford can see that this is not a good thing, that this is what leads them to into this suicidal charge. The word suicide is used in the film. Wayne says, "That's suicide, Colonel." And then Ward Bond says, "The madman." And yet they go to their deaths, they ride off to their deaths, and we feel for them because we like these characters, but we realize they're wrong if you think about it. Why do they follow this man? They could have arrested him. You know, you're under the military code of justice, you're supposed to not follow illegal, immoral orders that are war crimes, and yet they do it. And but a lot of people just sort of miss that point. And I found a letter in Ford's papers. A woman wrote to him in 1948 and said, "How come you've just been making mostly Westerns since you came back from the war?" And Ford let his hair down. He didn't usually explain things, but he said, "Well, you know, the thing is, if you make films on contemporary subjects in today's really fraught climate," and he was talking about, this was with the Red Scare, the Cold War, you know, Hollywood was, the blacklist had started. Um, he said, "You get in a lot of trouble if you deal with contemporary social issues, but if you make Westerns, you can deal with the same issues and nobody notices." Because Westerns really were not taken seriously. I mean, the American critics were, reviewers were so ignorant and snobbish that they just kind of condescended to Westerns. If you read, like, the worst critic in American history is a guy named John McCartan on the New Yorker. He makes Bosley Crowther look like Francois Truffaut. You know, McCartan would just sneer at Westerns and most American films. That was the typical highbrow attitude. His review of The Searchers has to be read to be believed, and so they didn't even care what was going on in a Western. They didn't notice. So Ford could attack military vainglory and megalomania and genocide and racism and all that, and nobody would notice because there's a lot of, you know, I mean, they didn't pay attention or even go see the films. And so he made these fascinating films. And by the time he made The Searchers in 1956, it's a terrific study of a racist. I'm teaching a whole course on The Searchers right now. John Wayne gives a great performance as a racist who's searching for his niece, and he's actually trying to kill her. It's an absurdist, just very disturbing film about racism. And I read the reviews of that film that came out at the time in America. It got really good reviews, and not one review said he was a racist. I think the Variety review said something like, "There's something wrong with this guy, but we can't quite put our finger in it on it, you know," because the culture was so racist they didn't even recognize it, which is the worst form of racism. You know, if you don't recognize your own racism, and it was understood more in Europe, and later critics in later generation picked up on it. But it just went over their heads, sailed over their heads, you know, and it was just another John Wayne Western. But Fort Apache, the script is by Frank Nugent, and I was, as I say, trying to be a screenwriter. And the scripts that influenced me the most were Citizen Kane by Herman Mankiewicz and Orson Welles, which I typed a copy of because I found it at the Wisconsin Historical Society, and I didn't have the money to copy it, so I typed a script for a whole month. And that was my Bible, and I had a copy of the film, and I used that, and I taught myself how to write scripts. And but the other one that influenced me was Frank Nugent's script for Fort Apache, which is a marvelous novelistic script. It has a lot of characters and a lot of women as well as men. It creates a whole picture of this family of community of people in the fort, and then the Native American characters are vividly rendered. And the whole historical story is woven in so well with the personal stories. And what's even more remarkable is it's based on a very racist short story by James Warner Bella, who was this crazed racist, but he came up with good plots, and he seemed to hate the military. So Ford adapted some of his stories, but they're kind of unreadable because they're so horribly racist. But Nugent did a 180-degree turn with the script and made the film sympathetic to Indians. And so I think the credits say it's suggested by a short story by James Warner Bella, but it's a marvelous screenplay. Nugent was a New York Times critic who liked Ford's films, and then he was brought to Hollywood by Daryl Zanuck. And the story was that he was brought by Zanuck because Zanuck didn't like that he was panning too many Fox films, especially films with Tyrone Power was his bugaboo. So he hired him as a screenwriter, and then he wouldn't let him write screenplays for years. He just screwed him. And so Nugent started writing magazine articles. He met Ford, and Ford said, "Why don't you write a film about the cavalry? Because in most films, the cavalry just rides in and fights Indians, but we never learn about them as people." And so Nugent did a tremendous amount of research on this. And Catherine Clifton, the story editor, told me how much research they did. And Mrs. Custer's 2 books, she was a very good writer, Elizabeth Custer. She wrote 2 excellent books on life as a cavalry officer's wife. And they used those books and other books for historical details. So it's very accurate. And Ford had tried to make a film about Custer in the 30s called Glory Hunter, which tells you his attitude toward Custer was not positive. And they wouldn't make a film like that back then. They made this rather ridiculous film called They Died with Their Boots On that somehow turns Custer into a hero, even though it's a very rousing film. It's historically ludicrous. But so Ford had to fictionalize it to get away with it. And he did a very clever thing. Joe Breen was the chief censor at the time, and Ford had to get the script cleared. Joe Breen was this arch Catholic, Irish American Catholic, very censorious guy. And so Ford wrote him a letter, and he said, "Hey, Joe, I made this film that's tribute to the Irishman who served in the cavalry, and our people will love this film. And it's really just, that's, he stressed that theme, and he kind of distracted him from what the film was really about." So Joe Breen said, "Hey, great, go to it," and Ford even got Leo McCarey to invest a lot of money in the film. And McCarey was a super reactionary. And it's funny because Fort Apache is one of the most subversive American films I've ever seen. And so I was just kind of amazed by this. And I asked Ford about the cavalry films he made, and he said the cavalry weren't all American boys. They made a lot of mistakes. You just mentioned Custer. That was a pretty silly goddamn expedition. So Ford was a more complicated man, you know than a lot of people realize. That's why it took me 30 years to write the book. And one of the key things I learned, I was a good friend of Abraham Polanski, who was a blacklisted writer director. He made another one of my favorite Westerns, Tell Them Willie Boys, here, a great film that's neglected. And I once referred to Ford as conservative, and he said, "Oh, no, you shouldn't say that. It's too simplistic." He wasn't liberal or conservative. You couldn't pin him down politically. He was so complex. And I wrote a long piece, you can find it online, called The Convoluted Politics of John Ford for the Los Angeles Times Magazine, which is a kind of I took all the political themes from my book and put it into one article. And one of the things I did with Ford, at various times in his life, he called himself a socialist Democrat. And Grapes of Wrath is one of the more radical films made in Hollywood. And then he turned conservative, and then he turned liberal again, and then he turned conservative again. But he was all over the map politically as a person. But his films are very complex too. And one of the most profound comments I heard, one of the Native American women, Lillian Bradley Smith, who knew him and was in his films, I said, "What did you think of his treatment of Native Americans in his films?" And she said, "Well, it depends on who wrote the scripts." I thought, wow, that's a really smart comment, because critics don't ever even realize that. She said, we look at American films sometimes and we don't understand them. I thought that was a great comment, because who's more American than Native Americans? But she said there were things in Ford's films that made sense and other things didn't make sense. And, they would laugh at certain things in Westerns, like the fact that a white man would shoot a rifle and 6 Indians would fall off their horses. They would crack up. The Indians, I found, they had a great sense of humor if you got to know them, and they kind of, you had a rapport with them, which I did and Ford did. They would talk about how funny they found a lot of Western conventions. I call that the magical rifle of the white man. But they're so pragmatic. I interviewed one of the stuntmen who was in all of the Ford Westerns there. And I said, "Did that bother you, that somebody'd fire a rifle and 6 guys would fall off their horse?" And he said, "No, because we all got paid for doing a horse fall. You got extra for doing a horse fall, because they were starving. They were, broke, and Ford gave him work and he was good to them. And so they kind of accepted some of the things that were kind of ludicrous conventions. But Fort Apache is one of the most accurate Ford films. Um, and I found a quote from Gallagher. He said, it's incessantly cited as a typical example of everything wrong with John Ford, but it's one of his most profound films. And Walter Hill, the director, said, "Ambiguity is the home of the artist, the great artist," and he was referring to Ford. So by giving you sympathy with both the perpetrators and the victims, sympathy in the aesthetic sense, if not, you don't feel that they're in the right at all for attacking the Indians. And John Wayne tries to stop it, but one of my students pointed out that he doesn't stop it. He said Dante put people like that in the lowest circle of hell, people who know what's wrong and don't stop it. And I think, wow, my student is right. As much as we like the Wayne character, he acquiesces, and that's the tragedy of the system. And Russell Campbell, a friend of mine, wrote a piece on the film he called Wayne's character the Obedient Rebel. And he said, Ford creates an ideal community in the film, Russell Campbell wrote, and he said it was the kind of community that only existed in certain early religious communities and among Native Americans. And it's destroyed by this man who is vainglorious and has all the flaws of Custer. And it shows what a misguided military man can do to wreck ordinary people's lives. But they should have stood up to him, and they didn't, and that's a tragedy. And so it's a very complex film. And just to say a little word about John Wayne, he's my favorite actor. I love John Wayne's acting. And if the world were fair, he would have about 7 or 8 Oscars. I think you could mention various films like She Wore a Yellow Ribbon and Sands of Iwo Jima and The Searchers he should have won Oscars for, instead of True Grit, where he's making fun of himself. But he's a much more complex figure than people realize. And I saw him and Jimmy Stewart shooting The Shootist. I went on the set for 2 days when I was on Variety. It gave me a chance to go on sets of films. And people often make this ludicrous comment that John Wayne is just playing himself. And when they say that, they don't understand film acting or acting at all, because stardom is about creating a persona and as something people like to see, and then you play inflections on it, but you don't go to see it because John Wayne doesn't put on like a lot of phony makeup and stuff, and like doesn't look like Dustin Hoffman and Midnight Cowboy. That's a different kind of acting. But I asked Wayne about that, and he says, it is quite obvious it can't be done. If you are yourself, you'll be the dullest son of a bitch in the world on screen. You have to act yourself. You have to project something, a personality. Perhaps I've projected something closer to my personality than other actors have. I have very few tricks. Oh, I'll stop in the middle of the sentence so they'll keep looking at me. And I don't stop at the end so they don't look away, but that's about the only trick I have. And that's one of the things I love about Wayne's acting, is that kind of pause that he has in the middle of a sentence. And to me, that gives a vulnerability to these very strong characters he plays. And it reminds me of Hemingway's characters, who are often mistakenly regarded as purely macho, but Hemingway is really examining male fragility and flaws, and John Wayne's characters do that too. But he is kind of a father figure in what he represents in some of his roles. But he doesn't usually play a villainous character. But in The Searchers, he's an anti-hero, and he's somebody that we feel very mixed about. But let's move on to one more film that really meant a lot to me and helped shape me. I saw this one when I was at college. I didn't see it when it came out. Shane. And it is heretical for me as a John Ford fan. He's my favorite director. To say Shane is my favorite Western. And I get mocked for saying that occasionally, but Shane is an underrated film. And I think George Stevens is the most underrated great American director. He made many, many wonderful films. And I think Shane, what I like about Shane is it's an attempt to do this sort of ultimate Western, classical Western, and yet it has so many complexities to it. It's romantic, and yet it undercuts the romanticism in different ways. There's Alan Ladd there on the right, as you can see, playing this guy who is, he was very short. He didn't have that looming macho thing that John Wayne has, but that's kind of an interesting paradox. He has a charisma, and he's a gunfighter in this film, and he has this fancy outfit. And Jean Arthur, my favorite actress there, and Van Heflin play this typical pioneer family like my ancestors. And when he arrives on the scene, the family is under threat by the cattle, and it's a plot that's been used thousands of times before. It's the same plot Ford used in his first feature film, Straight Shooting, for example, but it's archetypal, and Stevens revitalizes it. And one way he does it is that he shows the wife falling in love with Alan Ladd, the gunfighter, and it's all done without words. It's so subtle. And Stevens, before World War II, was a great director of romantic comedies, and this is kind of a Western crossed with a romantic comedy drama. And Stevens, I interviewed him a couple times, and he was with the U.S. Army liberating Dachau. He photographed the war. It changed him, and I said, "How did it affect you?" And he said, "It has the most profound adjustment on your thinking. I don't think I was ever as hilarious again." He made much more somber films after the war. And he said as time went on, he began thinking he should do his war film. He said all the other guys were doing their war films like Ford and Weiler and people like that. And he said, I've been shying away from it. And then he said, Shane to me is my war film. He said, people may not have noticed it, but it was. And one thing he didn't like was Western TV shows where, or just Western movies in general, people are firing guns at each other all the time. And he wanted to show how lethal a gunshot is. And so he saved the first gunshot for about an hour into the film. And the kid, Brandon DeWilde, asked Shane to fire his gun because the kid is impressed by this romantic figure. And Shane fires the gun, and Stevens fired off a cannon next to the camera to give this tremendous effect. And it is really a shock. And the film is told from the viewpoint of this kid. And the first time I saw this film was at the University of Wisconsin. George Stevens came and showed his own personal print, and that was wonderful. The print is sublime. I saw it on 2 other occasions. And it's filmed from the viewpoint of the boy, which I got right away. It's kind of like us in my generation of baby boomers, and Stevens puts us into the film. And when I really got that is the climactic fist fight. The kid is watching and he's eating candy while he's watching it, just like we did when we were watching these Westerns. It's so wonderful. And the ending is so famous where Shane has to leave because he doesn't want to destroy the family. He and the woman realize that they can't do anything about their kind of, understated romance. And so Shane leaves for the good of the family. And he's also wounded in this gunfight, and he rides into the mountains, and basically you feel he's going to die. To me, Shane is an angel. I realize after watching this film, he's portrayed as an angelic figure. He's almost unreal in the way he looks and behaves, and his abilities and his goodness, and yet he's a killer, and that's the paradox. And the boy says, Shane, come back, mother wants you, father needs you. That's the essence of the film there. Mother wants you, father needs you. And he just rides on, and it's heartbreaking. And Stevens cuts to a close-up of the boy, and Donald Ritchie wrote a book on Stevens. He said the big close-up of the boy's tear-stained face is the cry of innocence and pain, he said. And Jean Arthur, who was such a great actress, this is her last film, she basically quit movies. I said, why did you quit movies in 1944? And she told me the truth. She said Harry Cohn at Columbia, she was under contract. The women's dressing rooms were all in a row, and there was a secret passageway connecting them to a door. And Harry Cohn would come in the door and attack the women in the dressing rooms. And she was so horrified by this that she decided to kill Harry Cohn. And she started imagining how she'd get a gun and shoot him in the passageway and nobody would realize it, which obviously they would have figured it out. But she said, instead, I walked the streets of Columbia for 3 hours and decided not to and just quit the business instead. So she went back to college and only made 2 more movies. She did a film for Billy Wilder called Foreign Affair, and then she did Shane because she respected these 2 directors. So she was an unorthodox person, very rebellious character. And she told me she never liked playing housewives. She played working women, you know, and she always had a job. And she turned on It's a Wonderful Life because she said, I didn't see anything in that character, you know, that was interesting. But she plays a housewife in Shane, but she's a housewife who's in love with this other guy. And there's a great scene at the end of the film when she says goodbye to Shane. And there are many ways you could film that, you know, with this romantic undertone or subtext. Instead, she just takes his hand and she holds his hand for a long, long time, and this long pause. And she says, let's see if I wrote this down. She says, please, Shane. Then there's a big pause. You wonder what she's going to say. And she says, please. You know, she could say a lot of different things. And then there's a pause and she says, take care of yourself. And then he goes, and she's holding her son, you know, because the family is more important to her, and her husband is reliable. And I said, what were you thinking during those long pauses? And she said, I was thinking, why am I such a fool as to let this beautiful guy go and stay with my boring husband? She said, you know, that's what she was thinking when she did that scene. But the fact that Van Heflin plays a boring husband, he's the reliable, dull guy, but he's a stalwart guy, plays it very well. And Shane is not reliable. He's a gunman, and he's got a past, and he can't really settle down, and she realizes that. And all these complexities make this such a powerful film, with these tensions within the Western. As Renoir said, you can take, you know, a basic Western story and make anything of it. And Stevens made the story of incipient adultery that doesn't occur. And the pictorial quality of the film is sublime. It's like the Garden of Eden, but it's broken into by these great violence. And it points forward to the trend of Westerns later, the Sam Peckinpah films, for example, and Arthur Penn films, where extreme violence happens in The Wild Bunch, and Bonnie and Clyde is kind of a Western, and Little Big Man, Arthur Penn's film. There's a famous scene where Elisha Cook Jr. is shot by Jack Palance, and he's blown backwards. It's really shocking. And he's blown into the mud, and that influenced Peckinpah quite a lot. And I'll just close on Shane by saying that Warren Beatty, who produced Bonnie and Clyde, was showing the film at the London premiere, and the sound wasn't right, so he went up to the projection booth and said to the old projectionist, you know, what are you doing? He said, oh, you know, I keep turning the dial because, he said, I haven't had such a badly mixed picture since Shane. And Beatty said, well, I wanted it that way because Shane was one of Beatty's favorite films. And he, you know, when the gunfire goes off in Shane, it blasts this gigantic sound effect. And Beatty had some sound effects in there when the gunfire goes off. And, you know, it's fun and games until they start shooting people. And then it's like a huge shock. But this conventional old projectionist thought this was a mistake. And so Beatty thought that was wonderful. I haven't had such a picture as poorly mixed since Shane, because that's what he was after. So it's a direct influence on the modern Western. And the thing about Westerns, you know, Star Wars came along. I remember Roger Corman said at the time, kids today are going to be watching science fiction films because they're like Westerns, and Star Wars is influenced by The Searchers, as are other films like Close Encounters of the Third Kind and Taxi Driver, and a lot of films are influenced by The Searchers. But the sci-fi film and the superhero films have kind of taken over as the preferred genre by kids, younger people. And American commercial films now are made for the 12 to 24-year-old male mindset, and the really interesting films about people and dialogue and stories are on cable or streaming. But Westerns keep coming back, and as Scott Simmons said, they've been pronounced dead from the beginning, and they keep getting pronounced dead. The Vietnam War took away our illusions about the frontier, but every once in a while there's a good Western that somebody has the clout to do it, like Clint Eastwood did Unforgiven. won the Best Picture award. The COEN brothers did No Country for Old Men. The COEN brothers here, this is The Ballad of Buster Scruggs, which I love. This is a great, great film. It's on Netflix. You can watch it. That's Zoe Kazan, really moving performance as a young woman on a wagon train, like my great-great-grandmothers in Nebraska, where they actually filmed this. And it's a heartbreaking story. It's a classically filmed tale, but it's an anthology of Western stories, and some of them are outlandish parodies. There's a parody of Singing Cowboys. There's a parody of Sergio Leone films. There's some very bleak episodes, and then there's this episode which is classical, like Ford's Wagon Master, but it ends tragically. And it's a very moving film, but it shows you the Western can be revitalized endlessly by new filmmakers who put their own sensibilities into it. And I've long thought the way to revitalize Westerns is to tell stories that haven't been told before, such as stories of women and minorities in the West, like something like a fourth of the cowboys were Black, and you very seldom see Black cowboys in Westerns. And there is a Black Western out now. And women's stories, The Ballad of Little Joe is a terrific Western. And also contemporary Westerns, films like No Country for Old Men or The Last Picture Show some years ago, those kind of films resonate with people. Rancho Deluxe was another good one. It's a genre that is endlessly alive and can be used for all kinds of stories and all kinds of feelings. And anyway, but that's how Westerns made me, and I keep enjoying them. I keep enjoying the classics, and I keep enjoying when somebody makes a good new one. But now I'd like to hear from you and have questions and thoughts. Anything? Oh, my book on the Coen brothers is coming out soon. I love them. I think they're kind of the contemporary Billy Wilders as much as anybody. They deal with satire, and they love to make fun of genre conventions, and they mix genres daringly and controversially like Billy Wilder did. But let's have some questions. Tess, if you could throw some at me, or have the audience throw them out. How are we doing this? Thank you for listening.
I have allowed all the participants to unmute themselves and ask questions.
Good. I see a few people. I see my friend Joe Green there. Actually, moving image of Joe. Joe, do you have a question?
Yeah. Actually, I was one of I think one of the first things you ever told me actually was very distressing about Ward Bond. And in this time, like you've alluded to, the idea is that if you're morally repugnant, then you have no aesthetic power. That somehow these two things are entwined in a way that I don't think they are. But did finding out what you found out about Ward Bond then affect how you viewed his films?
Well, let me just preface it with Frank Capra, who I really admired, maybe naively. I found out he was an informer during the blacklist period, and then I started investigating how could he do this and betray the ideals of his best films like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. And I found out that he was not the man he claims to be, and he was I disagree with him on so many points, and he's a very complex figure, interesting man. But I still like his films. I understand them better because I know where they're coming from and some of the complexities, because people said they're left-wing views and right-wing views and moderate views in the same film, and how could that be? And now I understand, because they're not totally the product of one man, because he had liberal writers and left-wing writers. That's one reason he got in trouble. So you got Ward Bond, who was this kind of oaf, as Nunnally Johnson called him, who was uneducated. Well, he went to USC. I guess he wasn't totally uneducated, but he was a football player with John Wayne, and Ford made him an actor. He was a wonderful actor. Henry Brandon, who plays Chief Scar in The Searchers, gave me a great interview. Very, very erudite, sophisticated man. And he said, Ward was a shit and he was a good actor. And I think that's a great line. I want to write a piece about Ward Bond and that idea. You can be a shit and a good actor.
Yeah.
And those are not mutually exclusive. And a lot of artists are terrible people, and it doesn't mean that they're not great artists. But part of it is you have John Ford, you know, controlling this guy. Ford had a very mixed view of Bond. He loved to make fun of him. He said he was his favorite horse's ass, and he was always making fun of him. But he loved him at the same time. It was a mixed view, but Bond is great in the Ford films, like Wagon Master. He plays this wonderful patriarch on a wagon train, and The Searchers, he plays a complex character who's a minister and a Texas Ranger, and it's just a wide range of good performances. And he's one of the few actors. I wrote a book called The Book of Movie Lists. I had a list of actors who were never bad, and I had Ward Bond on there. He's just a really good actor. And he seems to be a terrible human being because he helped run the Blacklist. And as Henry Brandon said, he said Ward Bond and Hedda Hopper ran the Blacklist. Slight exaggeration, but close. And he said, if you do that to a cowboy, if you take away his horse, you'd get hung. He said, I thought that was a great line too. He said, I enjoyed when Ford was abusing Wayne, but he said, you can't take it away from him. He's a good actor. It's just a complexity of human nature. Being a good artist doesn't have a lot to do with whether you're a good citizen, you know. I mean, I guess that's the complexity of the whole thing. Some people do things that are so reprehensible you never want to see them again. But then, you know, in today's world, we have somebody like Woody Allen who did not commit any crimes, and he's still blacklisted. You know, so we're in a new blacklist period, which is disturbing. But Ward Bond helped blacklist people and keep people from working. And I don't know. It's one of those conundrums that doesn't. You can still enjoy his performances, knowing what a horrible guy he was, I guess. Do you feel that way too?
I do. Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, good. Another question.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
We have a question here in the chat that says, what do you think of the way Stevens presents a villain that we can actually empathize with somewhat?
Well, the villain in Shane, well, there's a couple of villains. One is Jack Palance, who plays this sort of reptilian gunfighter. I'd say it's kind of hard to empathize with him because he's like a figure out of allegory of a really bad guy, like, you know, a creepy character. But maybe you're thinking of the old rancher who's played by Emil Meyer, who gives a good speech early in the film about, you know, I built this country, you know, and I took it from the Indians, which is not admirable, but I mean, he carved out this big ranch, and then these homesteaders are moving and taking his land, and you kind of understand where he's coming from. And I remember Capra told me, he said, when you have a villain, give him his best arguments. I thought that was a great piece of advice for a screenwriter. So Stevens and his writer, A.B. Guthrie Jr., and Jack Schur was another writer, they gave Emil Meyer good arguments that, you know, you can understand why he feels that, you know, this is my land and you guys are moving in, and get the hell off my land, you know. But he uses bad methods of hiring a gunfighter to terrorize people, etc. So you kind of have a human understanding of the guy. I mean, understanding and sympathy are not exactly the same thing. I suppose empathy and understanding are more related than sympathy. In today's movies, you're expected to like people too much, and I think they sand off the rough edges. I think if they did The Searchers today, somebody would say, does he have to be a racist? You know, I mean, really, come on. You know, my friend Stuart Gordon, my late friend, he directed the wonderful Ice Cream Suit for Disney, which is based on a charming play by Ray Bradbury about a group of Mexican men in 1941, LA, Mexican Americans, and they're very poor, but they pool their money to buy a beautiful white suit, and each one wears it one day of the week. And so Stuart made this film, and he told me when he had his meeting with Disney, they said, do they have to be Mexicans? That's what the whole story is about. But that's typical Hollywood today, right? I mean, that's what makes life interesting, is complexity. And I think today's audiences don't have a high tolerance for complexity, and either in watching films or in understanding the people who make the films. They think if, you know, it's like with Capra and other people, if you think if you like the films, the person who directed them must be a wonderful guy, and that's not, it doesn't follow logically, you know. And he's not the only person who made them. I really think Robert Riskin was the auteur of Capra's films primarily. So another question. And the thing about Westerns, to bring it back to Westerns, what makes them good is the good guys and the bad guys are not simple. If you look at Bud Bedeker's Westerns, for example, he made great Westerns with Randolph Scott. Randolph Scott is an admirable, stalwart Western guy, but he's kind of rigid. But what makes those films particularly interesting is the bad guys turn out to be sympathetic and interesting, even though they do bad things, kill people or whatever, but they're always kind of fascinating characters. And Bud Bedeker and his writers like Burt Kennedy complicate the picture. That's what the best Westerns do for us. So, when I had some student who said, who wrote a paper saying, in the Westerns, the heroes always wear the white hat and the villains wear the black hat, and it's good versus evil. And I said, how many Westerns have you seen? And she said, oh, maybe about 10. I've seen thousands of them, and I can tell you that there are many Westerns that don't fit that mold. That's what makes it a good genre. Yeah, I see. Terry puts her thumb up. Is that a question?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, Terry, I can hear you.
Hi. Oh, there's so much to say. I, like you, grew up in the 50s where every day after school, they were just, the television was full of Westerns on TV. So I've always loved Westerns too. I never got it that Shane was wounded and might be going off to die. So I'd love to hear you say a little bit more about that. And also anything you want to say about I guess I would call it a trope, the plot that's so popular in Westerns about the gunslinger who wants to hang up his guns, but for one reason or another is pulled back in. I mean, you can think about The Godfather 3, the same idea.
Yeah.
And then one more thing.
Every time I want to get out of it, they pull me back in.
Yeah. And then just one more thing is I myself taught a class this last summer on Westerns, and I chose 3 that I thought were great. And Winchester 73 I'd never seen before, and I couldn't get over how fabulous it was. And partly because I'm in love with Dan Duryea as the bad guy. He's just so perfect at that. But the combination of a really great woman's role with Shelley Winters, and then Henry Fonda was so good in that. One of the things that I see now when I look at Westerns from a more critical view and the view of someone who's going to teach them is how often the women get they get abandoned in the process. They're just not, they're either really poor actresses or very, very shallow roles. So when there's a really well-written woman's role, I feel like that's part of what makes a Western stand out for me now.
Well, you brought up a lot of really good points. I would challenge one assumption. I taught a course on women in the Western, and there is a book on that subject. And I think there are a lot of great women in Westerns, and a friend of mine wrote an essay on that. And sure, there are a lot of Westerns where the woman is just sort of around and it's guys shooting it out, but those are not the best Westerns. But the best Westerns, like Naked Spur with Janet Leigh, another Anthony Mann film. He directed Winchester 73. She's terrific, and she's one of the main characters. There's so many good women in Western films. I was just showing my class The Man Who Shot at Liberty Valance, Ford's great film. And I found a letter he wrote to one of his Irish relatives when he was editing the film, and he said, it's a very different film. He said it's a film aimed at women. And Vera Miles is the center of that film. She makes all the key decisions in the film. She's the one who galvanizes the plot completely. And if you look at it carefully, which people didn't do at the time, it's a John Wayne, Jimmy Stewart, Lee Marvin Western, but Vera Miles is really the one who runs everything. And so it is a genre. There were so many great women in the West. I mean, half the people in the West were women, and they were tremendously strong women back then. And you do see that reflected in a lot of Westerns.
Thank you for that. I'm going to look for that book, and you've helped kind of refresh my thinking about that.
Yeah, and a lot of great Westerns, you'll find terrific women. Jean Arthur and Shane is wonderful.
Yes.
But you mentioned Shane is wounded in the gunfight at the end, and the kid says it, "Oh, Shane, you're hurt," and he says, I'm okay," but he's seriously wounded and he's bleeding. And the last shot of the film, he's riding through a graveyard up into the mountains, and it's kind of like this very cloudy, dark perspective, and you see him kind of hunched over in the saddle, and it's you know, it's not clear that he's dying, but he looks kind of like he's dying. I see that as him ascending back into heaven. He's an angel who comes down to help the family, and then he goes back to heaven. That's my take. And angels in the Bible always say, "Don't be afraid of me," when they show up, because people are always afraid of them. There's a great shot at the beginning of the film when he rides in, the boy is watching, and you see him framed through the antlers of a deer.
Yes.
And I asked Stevens how he did that, and he said it was kind of an accident, but the first time it happened, we didn't quite get it, so we had a guy with a bucket with rocks, and we shook the bucket so the deer would lift his antlers at the right moment. It worked perfectly.
Well,
But,
another way I think of him as the archetype of the angel is the archetype of the healer. That he's this paradox of truly at his heart he's a healer, but he's gotten caught in this
oh yeah,
this role of being a warrior.
yeah, and actually, you know, the word Shane, I told this to George Stevens Jr., a friend of mine. He's got a wonderful autobiography coming out, by the way. He's the guy, he was a kid and he found the novel and he told his dad this should be a good film. And I said, "George, you know that the word Shane in Irish means beautiful? And it's also in German, Shane means beautiful. And Shane is a beautiful man. He's a beautiful figure. And yet he's a killer. And that's the paradox. And he says, there's no going back from a killing. And, you know, one of the best films of that period is the Gunfighter, Henry King film.
Yes.
Andre Dutath and William Bowers wrote the script. It's a tremendous screenplay. And Gregory Peck is great as a gunfighter. And this is a plot that's been used before, but never better than in Shane or the Gunfighter, where he's trying to give up gunfighting, but everywhere he goes is some young punk who wants to challenge him to make a name as the guy who shot so-and-so, you know. So you can't get away from it. That's what Shane is saying. You can't, you know, you kill a man. And George Stevens was trying to make a serious point about how we take Westerns, you know, there are things that are bad about Westerns. One is that they make life seem cheap sometimes, you know, just shooting people. And we just saw in this film Rust, you know, where this cinematographer got shot. It makes me kind of think when I see Western gunfire now, how careful they have to be with firing blanks and guns, and you know, a blank can kill you. But you know, one thing, I didn't like TV Westerns much when I was a kid because I didn't like the back lot look, but one that I liked was Have Gun Will Travel.
Yes.
And I've been seeing them again because Ida Lupino directed a lot of them, and I love her directing. And I like that because it's an intelligent protagonist played by Richard Boone, who's a great actor. And he's an intellectual. He lives in a hotel in San Francisco, and he's a connoisseur of fine wine and women, and he's a sophisticated guy. And then he gets these jobs, he goes off, but he's always trying to solve a problem without killing somebody. He uses a gun as the last resort. And I liked that as a kid. I thought, well, this is kind of, you know, different. He's not just out there banging away with his gun. So
I love that. I'll have to see those again because those stand out for me too. And partly because there was something really sexy about him, something really dark and sexy.
Yeah, and he's part Native American too. And that's interesting. Some of the Western actors were part Native American. He's one of the great actors, didn't get enough credit. But I didn't like a lot of, at one point, I think there were 19 Westerns on the air at one time, and I didn't watch. I've never seen Gunsmoke. I must be one of the few people on the planet who's never seen Gunsmoke. I just wasn't interested. But I sort of liked the Rifleman because it was a father-son story.
Yes.
When I was a little kid, I liked Hopalong Cassidy and the Cisco Kid. I'll tell you a funny story that when we were kids too, not only did we see Westerns, we all had cowboy outfits. I'm sure Joe did too. And we had 6 guns and, you know, cap guns. And one time I was wearing my Hopalong Cassidy outfit, and there was a policeman standing on the corner of my block talking to somebody. And I went up to this cop and I pulled my 6 guns and I said, "Stick 'em up, you copper-eyed copper." And today, if you did that, you'd get blown away.
Oh, you'd be in trouble. My brother and I had matching cowgirl and cowboy outfits, and we treasured them. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your good questions, and that's the thing. Yeah, we were really into that back then, but we played cowboys and Indians. We didn't understand what we were doing, you know. And so there is a kind of a friend of mine said the Western is a racist genre, and I reject that, because a lot of Westerns are not racist, and some are, and some aren't, and some explore racism. The more interesting ones do, and I guess that's part of my point here, is that if you're going to look at the genre, don't judge it by the bad examples, judge it by the good examples. It's true of all genres, but you know, the 1930s Westerns, those B Westerns, are pretty simple-minded. And although there's one that I love, John Wayne plays a cowboy who rides into town and he sees the horse is about to be hanged in the town square for killing its owner, and he saves the horse and rides away. That's the entire plot.
Wow.
I thought that's so simple and nice. Also, the most beautiful title in the history of cinema, in my opinion, is a John Wayne B Western called Somewhere in Sonora. What a beautiful title! My
It's a
God.
good-
Somewhere
Well,
in
and we need to allow our art to evolve, just like we need to allow our own evolution to evolve. So we can't hold art from those days accountable for the way we see the world now. That's part of the art and the artist, holding both, the paradox.
Yeah, I mean, it's complex, because there's a thing called presentism, which is we read everything through present sensibilities, which is a flaw. And yet it's also a flaw to say everybody was a racist back then, everybody had slaves. Like, I had a student who wrote a paper saying all the founding fathers had, all the guys who signed the Declaration of Independence had slaves. And so I checked it, and a lot of them didn't. Some were abolitionists. John Adams and his son John Quincy Adams were abolitionists, and you know, there was a division in our country from the very beginning between racists and non-racists. And you know, one reason the Western should be vital and usable today is that we're still stuck in the same historical rut that we were back then, of violence. You know, it's like the Wild West when a kid is running around Kenosha with a automatic rifle crossing a state line to go out and hunting people.
Yeah.
And if he gets acquitted, I mean, you know, that sends a signal that to all vigilantes. I mean, we're turning back into the Old West.
Yeah.
And the whole idea of wearing a gun to go to McDonald's or something is kind of crazy. And in some states you can do that.
I know. So, let's not get started on that, but I'll go ahead and mute myself so some others can talk. But thank you so much.
Thank you for the good questions. Yeah.
And we have time for one more question. There's one in the chat from David Gowdy.
Could you read it?
Yes. The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance is one of my favorite films. The editor's line about legend and fact conflict print the legend. Do you think Ford believed that, or was he revealing a truth about editors?
That's a great question to ask to end the whole topic, because it's such an important line. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend. No, Ford did not believe that. As Peter Bogdanovich points out in his excellent documentary directed by John Ford, which is on YouTube, by the way, you can watch it for free. Ford prints the fact. And he does the same in FORT Apache, that John Wayne lies to cover up this massacre. And yet Ford prints the truth about this massacre. Ford is pointing to the dichotomy in our history, which occurs over and over again between what we think happened and what really happened. And Liberty Valance was the only Ford film I saw on its first run in a theater in 1962. And it made a gigantic impression on me. And it helped prepare me for the shock of the Kennedy assassination, because it prefigures the Kennedy assassination. It has the flashback where it reveals that the guy who was supposedly the gunman was not the gunman, and there's a kind of a grassy knoll scene where two guys are involved in a conspiracy run by Vera Miles to kill the bad guy. And it shows that American history is just a gigantic lie. And so much of what we know, and Joe Green writes about this, he's a great historian himself, read his books. And I've been studying my whole life. I guess I'm interested in Westerns partly because they're about America and how we see our country and how we look at our history. And Gore Vidal calls us the United States of amnesia. And we tend to forget, you know, like there's a movement now, like teachers should not be allowed to teach slavery or genocide or whatever, crazy stuff. And I try in my classes to teach the truth, and but Ford was America's greatest myth maker, but in his later films, he was kind of tearing apart the myths and re-examining them. And Liberty Valance is nothing if not a subversion and dissection of the whole process of myth making. It's a brilliant screenplay by James Warner Bella and Willis Goldbeck, a story by Dorothy Johnson, and it analyzes itself. I won't even let students write a paper on it because it's too easy to write a paper on, because it analyzes itself. It's such an intellectual film. It's a film of ideas. But Ford does not believe in what the editor says, and it's tragic. And I'll just end with one little story. When I was on the set of The Shootist, I gave Jimmy Stewart the book that Mike Wilmington and I did on Ford Critical Study. And a few days later, I went to Stewart's house, and he said, I was reading your book. And I said, oh, great. He said, I read that chapter on Liberty Valance, and at the end of it, we said, the whole meaning of the film is when Vera Miles looks out the window of the train and says, once it was a wilderness, now it's a garden, aren't you proud? And there's a two shot of them, and his face is silent, and there's a flicker in his eyes. Ford was asked how to look at a movie. He said, look at the eyes. Everything is in the eyes. That's where you see people's characters. And you can tell he's not proud that what he's done is transformed the land in a way that Ford doesn't like. He doesn't like the modern world. Renoir said, it's really the only question of the age, this question of primitivism and how it can be sustained in the face of civilization, or I'm sorry, sophistication. Primitivism and how it can be sustained in the face of sophistication. Sophistication today is a good word, but it used to be a bad word because it came from sophistry. And we said that Ford is asking the audience at the end, are you proud of what's happened to America? And Stewart said, I thought about what you guys wrote. And he said, I think you're right. That is the point of the film. That is the meaning of the film. It's all in that look I give, He's asking us, are you proud? And the answer is no. And that's a sobering thing. And here's a Western that was, not taken seriously at the time. Variety actually wrote that it was an unsophisticated film. I mean, it's one of the most sophisticated films ever made. And Richard Brody of the New Yorker said it's the greatest American film. So go out and watch The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. It's Ford's reflection on history, and it tells us so much about our history and how we tell lies to cover up unpleasant things that we should really confront. I think if we don't confront the reality of what happened in the past, I mean, this has been said by many other people, we're condemned to repeat it, as Santayana said, but we're making the same mistakes war after war, year after year, and we're back in the Wild West again, and etc. So that's why Westerns are really so relevant, and I hope they have a big comeback. But I could tell they're relevant to all of you, and thank you for coming, and thanks for Tess and Catherine for having me.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to share this one more time.
My new book just came out. A critical study of one of my favorite directors, Billy Wilder. He never made a Western per se, but he made Ace in the Hole, which I guess you could consider sort of a Western because it's made in New Mexico. And it's about a guy unscrupulous reporter trapping a man in a cave. It's again about lies and the media lying to the public and destructive effect of that. And but anyway, thank you for showing that. Hope you read it.
And in the chat, you can see that Billy Wilder, Dancing on the Edge, is available through Columbia University Press with 20% off if you use the code CUP20. So head over there now and purchase that. And this masterclass has been made free to the public thanks to our generous donors. And if you feel inclined to donate, head to our website at avfilmsociety.org/donate. And thank you, Joseph McBride. This was a great chat, and we love having you here, and we hope you come back.
I'd love to come back. It's always a pleasure talking to you and your great audience, and really wonderful questions. And thank you for listening, and really had fun talking to you, all of you. And thank you, Tess and Catherine, and my friends. See you guys.
Thank you. Have a good night.
You too.